The one who eats this bread will live forever. Please be seated. You are what you eat. I'm sure you've heard this phrase before, many times, I imagine. The history of the phrase is actually mildly interesting. It kicked around France and Germany in the 19th centuries, as some intellectuals put it forward. And then in the 1930s, an American nutritionist and radio personality named Victor Landlar put forward the then revolutionary idea that food controlled health. So this was a radio program. It must have felt like a 1932 TED Talk. And then it really took flight in the 1960s as the nascent macrobiotic and whole food movement began to take flight. And this phrase, "you are what you eat," is ubiquitous today as it speaks of everything from nutrition to holistic health to economics to justice. So, a mildly interesting history. But it's also a way of getting at the meaning of the gospel today. This, of course, if you've been following the gospel passages, whether here or joining us online week after week, we've been hearing Jesus talk about being the bread of life. But what's different about this passage this morning is that it has as much to do with the person doing the eating as it does with the bread itself. Jesus says, "I am the bread of life." But this is not simply about spiritual nourishment. Eating the bread means abiding in Jesus. And that's the word that makes this passage a little bit distinct from all of those other passages where we hear about the bread of life. That word, abide. And it's the same word that you may recognize from the parable of the vine and the branches. Abide in me as I abide in you. And that's also what it means to receive and even consume the bread of life. To feast on Jesus, and I use that uncomfortable phrase intentionally, is to be changed into something holy. Because if Jesus is the bread of life, and if we're going to hold on to this idea that you are what you eat, then feasting on Jesus is a particular way that we abide in God. Now, if you find this idea a little bit uncomfortable, this idea of feasting on Jesus, then I assure you, you are not alone. We've been wrestling with this one for 2,000 years. In fact, I found out after the earlier service that at the Wednesday Bible study, they wrestled with it once again. What does it mean when Jesus says this? Now, the idea of eating Jesus' flesh does not lend itself to literal interpretation, and thank God for that. Martin Luther said, and this is a quote, "This is not the sort of flesh from which red sausages are made." Which tells me that Luther must have been a really interesting and entertaining preacher, and I would have liked to have heard him a few times. And that the key word of my flesh for Luther was not flesh, but my, meaning Jesus's. It means that Jesus is true nourishment, not the food of this world. But you know, going full metaphorical doesn't work either, because John Chrysostom, 1,000 years before Martin Luther, said that there is some literal connection between what Jesus says in the passage today and how we understand the sacrament. And what he wrote, was that we can't just look ephemerally on the loving idea of Jesus. Rather, Christians must fix their teeth in his flesh and be commingled with him. I know, right? That's not easy. Somewhere between the literal and the metaphorical, what we find is the space to abide. And in abiding, we find life. Now, we say you are what you eat, but maybe a better thing to say, or rather a better question to ask, is what is our relationship to the things that we consume? What is our relationship to the things that we put in our bodies? Because eating is far more than just eating, isn't it? We don't just eat in order to nab a quick calorie before getting on to the next thing. Our bodies have a relationship with food. Food gives pleasure. It carries cultural meaning. It communicates gratitude and celebration and love. It can also be dangerous. We can have too much of it, or too little of it, or only junk, or maybe because all of our bodies are unique, we can't eat bread or we can't eat meat. You see, we are in every moment in some kind of relationship with food, whether we're hungry, whether we're digesting, whether we're basking in the light of a great meal, or whether we're reading the result of a cholesterol test. We are in relationship with food. But you see, our spirits are also in relationship with God. And just as our bodies crave constant nourishment, our spirits crave the presence, the bread of life. It is a living dynamic. And in the spiritual life, we can starve, or we can be now malnourished, or we can survive on junk food only, or we can revel in the banquet of God's love for this world. The food metaphor in this gospel stands for dwelling in constant union with God. This brings us back to the metaphor of the vine and the branches. And I think the key word is constant. Just as our bodies require regular physical nourishment, our souls hunger constantly for union with God. We feast on Jesus. As awkward as that phrase might be to our rational minds, as uncomfortable as St. Chrysostom's words can make me feel, right? Fixing your teeth on Jesus. There is something about it that rings true. Maybe it's the dissonance with my rational mind that captures me. Well, in communion, I like the precision and the ambiguity of the words of institution. Jesus says, "This is my body. This is my blood." I'm okay with seeing the truth in those words without feeling like I have to decide what's literal and what's metaphorical. Being an Episcopalian to me means taking communion very seriously, but also being okay with ambiguity and really loving the mystery of all of it. But back to sinking our teeth into Jesus, which, let's be honest, seems kind of impolite, right? Yet there's no other word here. There's no other word than feeding, or maybe feasting, to describe what we do with the bread of life. George Buttrick, decades ago, wrote, "Really, to receive from Christ what he has to give us, really to have experience of his saving power, we must feed on him. There is no other word that expresses it with a like accuracy. Must absorb his teaching, his character, his mind, his ways, must appropriate the virtue there is in him, till his mind becomes our mind and his ways our ways, till we think somewhat as he would if he were in our place, and can be and do what without him we could not be or do. And this because his power has passed into us and become our power. We feed on Jesus, not only because he told us to do so. We feed on Jesus not only because we are spiritually hungry. We feed on Jesus because, well, you are what you eat. And we want to be holy, and we want to be made whole. I am the bread of life. We know the phrase, many of us know the hymn. We've heard it 1,000 times. Jenny, you probably sung it 2,000 times, whether it's Easter or funerals or youth conferences. My heavens, I've heard it a lot of times at those. But let's remember that this thing that hi Jenny, I meant Jesus, but no pressure, all right? This thing that Jesus tells us about himself is also about the ones who are doing the eating. Because bread is made to be eaten. Jesus gave this to us long before the language of sacrifice and doctrine became the only standards by which we could understand communion, which I think illuminates what the sacrament is at its heart. It's a moment of, communion, of feeding, of entering further into a relationship of abiding and mutual indwelling. The relationship with God is about stepping up to a banquet table spread with the food of grace and mercy, with the bread of life at the center of all of it. Jesus is the bread of life, given for the world and given to us. And the great gift of this is that we indeed become that which we eat. Amen.